sounds as though that kind of reflection also requires the teacher to challenge some of their own assumptions.
Yes, it does, I think. You know, Brookfield has argued in the past, for example, that an important aspect of reflective practice is challenging our assumptions. But of course, this is a very difficult thing to do because we don't know what our assumptions are. That's why they're assumptions. Our assumptions, you know, they are the way in which we interpret things that happen to us, the way in which we understand things. And there's an extent to which we need assumptions in order to live, to live our lives. There's a nice phrase, meaning schemes, from the literature on adult education. The idea that during our lifetime we develop certain meaning schemes, ways of understanding the world and experiencing the world, and new experiences, new information. Instead of changing the way we look at the world, we somehow manipulate this new experience, especially that which might challenge it. We manage to manipulate it in such a way that we can fit it into our existing meaning schemes. You know, I think we will understand how we do this. And you know, these are our assumptions. So to challenge them is very difficult. And one of the things about reflective practice, of course, is that it's very difficult to challenge your assumptions on your own, I think. For me, one of the important aspects of reflection on practice, if it's to be, you know, very useful, to particularly, you know, maximally useful, we might say, is that it's not always something that we do on our own. You know, it's something that we might do in discussion with other people, whether they are, you know, other teachers, other students, friends of ours. They might be our tutors at university or mentors in school or whatever. But it does seem very, you know, it clearly is very important, because there is no becoming, you know, if we don't challenge our assumptions. We will always just pretty much stay the way we are. And I think it's particularly, you know, if we go back to this issue about our own school days, for example, a lot of our assumptions about teaching and learning, of course, will have their roots in our own experiences of schooling. We'll have spent many, many years in school becoming used to certain ways of doing things. And we'll have obviously made decisions about what we think was good and what we think wasn't good, and so on and so forth. And inevitably, we're going to bring lots of assumptions about teaching and learning, you know, into the classroom with us. And you know, with beginning teachers, for example, we might encourage beginning teachers to explore certain theories of learning. And we know that many of them will say, "Oh, yeah, that's good," but many of them will resist certain theories because it doesn't quite, you know, fit, or they will pay lip service to it, but they won't really challenge what they do. So challenging assumptions is a challenge, but it's an important one, and for me it is an important part of what we mean by reflection on practice. It's to do with change in our understandings. It's to do with being flexible, with wanting to move on, with wanting to become all the time, to, you know, this idea of endless becoming.
So talking about reflective practice, in your book you actually develop that idea into this notion of reflexive teaching. Can you outline for us what that is?
Yes, I mean reflexivity is a tricky one. It's a kind of development of reflection on practice, or a particular way of reflecting on our practice, which doesn't replace the way we normally think of in terms of reflection on practice. You know, and there are many ways we can do this. But it tries to develop this idea that we were talking about, I think, of assumption hunting in a sense, and challenging our assumptions. And perhaps it's easiest to talk about two strands to reflexive practice, or reflexivity, I should say. One is to think about the sort of idiosyncratic, contingent nature of teaching, the messy complexity that we've mentioned of the classroom, but also you know, of society. So reflexivity encourages us to understand our practice, not in isolation from, you know, the wider society in which we live, or the wider world in which we live, but to factor those considerations in. So we don't pretend, for example, that you know, that our students' socio-economic and cultural backgrounds have no impact on how they experience schooling, or how they are in our classrooms, how they respond to what we do. We pay attention to that, we think about it. And again, it's part of this idea of not just thinking about, ourselves in isolation, about our personal qualities or our competencies or whatever. It's factoring in an acknowledgement and a developing understanding of the impact of students' lives outside school on the way they are and the way they learn inside school. And it would include, for example, understanding the impact of emotionality on students, understanding behaviour, for example, in terms of what happens outside school, and in doing that, perhaps developing some more appropriate ways of dealing with it. Not just dismissing someone's behaviour as bad or unacceptable, or it's against the rules. I mean, we may feel we need to punish bad behaviour in some way, but it's trying to understand it in terms of the student's wider life. So it's it kind of takes us outside the classroom in that sense, but it also takes us outside in another sense, in that it encourages us to try and explore our own feelings and our own responses. So for example, if we feel that something has upset us, if something has upset us in the classroom, we might begin to try and think about why it has, and that might involve exploring our own history, our own personal history, things that happened to us at school, in our families, and so on and so forth. So it's also about understanding our own emotionality, and not pretending that it's not important. As a teacher educator, I'm embarrassed when I look back now. I always used to say to my students on a PGC course, I'd churn out these platitudes, one of which was, you have to leave your emotional baggage outside the classroom. And I look back and I thought, this is a nonsense thing to say, really. We cannot just treat our emotions as things that you can kind of dump somewhere conveniently. We carry them with us. They are responses to things. We can't. So what we need to do is to understand them, and to know how to manage them, and to understand how they're affecting our practice, how they're affecting the way we're analysing things, we're reflecting on things in the classroom. So there are these two strands. One, as I said, taking account of the wider contexts within which education is taking place, in relation to individual students or to whole classes, and the other, trying to understand ourselves a bit better. Why we're feeling the way we're feeling about certain things. Why is it that something upsets me, and yet, my friend who teaches, the same class and they do the same things, it's just water off a duck's back. It is difficult because it can, as with all these other discourses, become very unhelpful. So it can be very helpful, but it can become unhelpful. And I think it becomes unhelpful because it can, again, focus too much attention, too much responsibility on the individual person. So there's a danger that understanding oneself can very easily turn into, blaming oneself or holding oneself exclusively responsible. But I think if it's done properly, and again with the help of others, reflexivity can be the best, most productive kind of reflection on practice. It doesn't just stop with, looking at this lesson or this series of lessons. It includes in the reflection a whole lot of other things which we often are encouraged to leave out. And a particular thing we're encouraged to leave out is our feelings. Teachers are not supposed to have feelings.